Welcome to this evening's event. This is the second part of our three-part series on the NEC contracts hosted by the Engineers Ireland GB region. Our speaker is William Brown, a qualified civil engineer, solicitor and adjudicator at Fortfield Brown. William is a director at Fortfield Brown, a specialist legal firm with expertise in construction law, contract training and dispute resolution. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to William.
Thank you very much, Healy, for that introduction. So just before we get started, folks, I just always like to check the IT. Could someone confirm you can hear and see me okay, please? Be that a yes in the chat box, or put your hand up if you have the ability to do that. Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Damien, just for confirming that. So again, same as last week. So people that were here with us last week know the score. If you've got any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. I think you've got the ability to unmute yourself, but if you don't, feel free to put it in the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go along. And for those of you that were not here last week, my name is William. I'll not go through the sales pitch any more than saying, there it is. If you've got any questions or queries, you've got my email address, and hopefully everyone should also have a copy of the slides as well. So in terms of this session's agenda, well, there's the first typo of this evening, William. That should be session 2. And we're very much picking up where we left off last week. To be honest, we're looking first of all at the early warning mechanism and the programming requirements of the contract. The second half of this evening, we're then going to be looking at, to call it an umbrella term, the compensation event mechanism. And the point is this, that the three things that you can see on the slide there, the early warning, the programming, and the compensation event mechanism, those three things are what makes the NEC different from its contemporaries, from the JCT, FIDIC, and so on. These are what I call project management tools, and they're built into the contract itself. Again, there's nothing to stop you using an early warning mechanism under any other form. The likes of FIDIC, for example, in its 2017 edition, has actually built in a form of an early warning mechanism. But as I say, you can do it under any contract. But what makes the NEC different is the fact that it's within the contract itself. And as we'll see shortly, if you don't follow the early warning mechanism, there are repercussions for the contractor. Similarly, if you don't get the program right and the project manager rejects the program for one of the reasons stated in the contract, there's repercussions, and perhaps the ability to deduct, again, minus 25% of the contractor's payments if you don't provide that first program. And for all of the other programs, it's the ability for the PM to make their own assessment of compensation events. So if you don't get it right, there are repercussions. And as I said before, only difference is between this and any other form of contract is these are built in from the outset. They are in there by default. So with plenty of content to get through this evening, so I'm going to hopefully get through it a bit quicker than I did last week. Starting with, the first thing that people tend to think about when you think of the NEC contract, in my empirical evidence gathering anyway, that is the early warning mechanism. And empirically, over the years, I tend to think that this is how client organizations will view early warnings, how project managers who are, let's say, new to the NEC, how they view early warnings. The first notion that I want everybody to understand is that this is an incorrect way of looking at it. It is not this negative thing that should be shrouded with a black cloak like that. It's a total opposite. To go the opposite, it should have a halo around it. It is something that is designed to spot potential changes and other issues at an early point so that you have the ability to avoid them. That should be a good thing for a client, a good thing for a project manager. It's the contractor coming to you to say, listen, I've spotted an issue. I've got all of this experience working in similar sites over the years, and I think this is going to be a problem. Let's get it sorted now before we start building. That can only be a good thing. So don't necessarily think of it as a contractor teeing up a claim. It's the ability to avoid a claim is the correct way of thinking about it. So why am I saying that then? So if you think of it in terms of these two things, well, the first thing is, again, we've got time along this x-axis, and then we've got the two factors that we're considering up the y-axis. So the first consideration is the cost of implementing a change. And the point is, if you spot a potential issue at an early point, let's call it T1, again, T1 early in time, then it's going to cost relatively little to implement that change. It could be as simple as changing a couple of lines on a drawing, or going into the 3D model and moving something about. It could be as simple as that. It could potentially cost nothing, or very, very little. It's low, relatively speaking. In that point in time as well, going up on our graph here, there's also a number of different possible things that you could do. You could move the drawing, you could move the line on the drawing, or fiddle about with the 3D model, or perhaps you might decide, you know what, I don't actually want to proceed with the contract anymore. That's still an alternative. But the point is, you've got lots of different things that you can do. You can all bash your heads together in an early warning meeting and come up with all of those alternatives. And the point being, each of those alternatives, relatively speaking, should be cheap to implement. Let's march forward in time to, T2, which is much later down the line. By this point, you have already built the foundations. So there's only so much you can do at that point. And if you want to start taking foundations out, or having to restructure the whole design around a lift shaft that's already been started, because you can't change that once it's been started. And if you do need to do all of that, it's going to cost you an awful lot more money, relatively speaking. And by the same token, you don't have as many alternatives available. Once, again, the elevator shaft, the lift shaft has been built, that's going to drive the sequence of the whole design. And there's only so much you can do in that scenario. Okay, you're limited in the alternatives that are available. Ian, I'm just going to mute you. Sorry about that, just to get a little bit of feedback on the line there. So that's the concept. That's what early warning is all about. It's all about correcting the course of the ship before you end up way off course. Again, that's an expensive problem to resolve at that point. In terms of why the NEC places such emphasis on this system, here's a couple of things. Number one, it recognizes that change in construction is inevitable. It always happens. I have never seen a construction project that didn't have any compensation events, that didn't have any change orders, or whatever you want to call it, a variation. There's always something has to happen to the documents. They're never perfect from the outset. And I would imagine that at least 95%, if not everyone in the audience, would agree with that statement. So given that change is inevitable, why not build a mechanism into the contract to deal with it up front? That's what the early warning system tries to do. And mindful of the fact that, change will happen, it is inevitable. Why does it, encourage you to early warn it? Well, the NEC point on that is from the guidance notes, and I've reproduced that on the screen. That foresight applied collaboratively, so in other words, getting everybody from both sides of the table, client, contractor, PM, subcontractors, other stakeholders, whoever it happens to be, to get them to work collaboratively and to look at what the potential solutions are. That's what the early warning system is all about. And to me, to say that in slightly more plain English, it's just contractualized common sense. If you were building a kitchen and the builder discovered that there was a problem, it was damp or whatever, whenever he was taking out the units, you would want to know about that so that you could put a mitigation strategy in place to fix the damp. The last thing that you want is him just to batter on, and then you have to rip out your lovely new kitchen in a couple of years' time. Again, it's just common sense. And that's what the NEC tries to instill within the contract as part of the early warning mechanism. So that's the theory behind it anyway. This next point is a really important one, and it's one that I found quite a lot of contractors and project managers who have never had any NEC training, who are new to the contract, they always get it wrong. And this is the point. You do not need to early warn to be entitled to a compensation event. Some people have this misconception that to be able to claim a compensation event, you must first have given an early warning. That is incorrect. Just going to let that sink in. You do not have to, as a precondition to getting a compensation event, have to have given an early warning. You simply don't have to have done that. If something already is a compensation event, in other words, if it is on the list of matters, that clause 60.1, because that's where you find all of the compensation events, then you skip straight to the compensation event mechanism. The ability to early warn it has sailed, and you don't need to do that anymore. This early warning mechanism all lives at clause 15 of the NEC 4, clause 16 of the NEC 3, just in case you're still using that form. Look at the clause numbers. One lives at clause 15, the other lives at clause 60. They're in totally separate parts of the contract for a reason. They are two entirely different things. Early warning is designed to potentially avoid or mitigate problems, but if a problem has already happened as a compensation event, then you jump straight into that category. Good question here from Paul Fortune. How does this CE, compensation event entitlement, relate to the time restriction for raising an early warning, say 8 weeks, which is the standard duration? Paul, you have made the mistake that most people make, which is the point I was making with this slide. People get these time frames confused. The 8-week timer that you're talking about, Paul, is within clause 61.3. And it requires you not to early warn, but to give a compensation event notification, a CEN, within 8 weeks of becoming aware of the event. We'll talk a little bit more about that this evening. What that clause does not require you to do is give an early warning. Really important distinction here. This is an early warning notice. This is a compensation event notice. Which of those notifications will stop the 8-week timer? Only one of them will stop it. Paul, what do you think? The CE notification. And this is the famous mistake that people make. Excuse me. They think by giving an early warning, they are stopping the 8-week timer. No, no, no. Just to reiterate that point, the only thing that will stop the 8-week timer is that, the 61.3 compensation event notification. So hopefully I'm being very clear. I'm trying to really emphasize this point. I have seen a number of contractors fail to give that clause 61.3 notice, and there were arguments about them being time barred as a result. Even though they gave the early warning, there was a very legitimate argument that they were time barred because they didn't notify it correctly. That's the only clause that will stop the timer. So we'll come back onto that later. This is the early warning mechanism then. As I say, it all lives within clause 15 of the contract. If you are under clause or NEC 3, it's the equivalent of clause 16. It's very, very similar. It's a fairly simple mechanism. Clause 15.1 is where you will find the obligation to give an early warning. And it effectively boils down to this, that either party, so in other words, the project manager or the contractor, both of them can give an early warning legitimately. You have to give early warning to the other of something that will affect time. In other words, something's going to delay the project, delay completion, or delay meeting a key date, or something that will affect the quality of the works, something that will impair the performance of the works in use, is how the contract describes that. In other words, the quality. For example, you've got a drawing that requires you to install a pipe with a valve, but there's no chamber to access the valve. There's no compensation event there because the drawing is what you have to build, but that's something that you would early warn, because if you build it, it's going to impair the performance of the project because you can't access the valve. Or to give a slightly more relatable example, if you're required to construct a concrete structure, an outdoor concrete structure, and there's no waterproofing membrane specified, that's going to impair the performance of the works because the water's going to eventually leak through it. So that's something you would have to early warn. Again, an example of something that would affect the quality of the job. And then lastly, something that will affect potentially the price of the works as well. So again, something is coming down the line that's potentially going to affect the bottom line. So if anything that will affect time, cost, or quality, either party has to give an early warning. That's what the contract says. This then is the early warning meeting. So if anybody is used to dealing with risk reduction meeting, the NEC 3, this is the new terminology that we use. We call it an early warning meeting. Under NEC 3, this used to be called the risk reduction meeting, just in case you're used to that form of contract. They're exactly the same. The only thing that's changed is what you call it. And the other thing that's changed is this, the fact that under the NEC 4, you have to have that meeting every 2 weeks by default. people will often go in and change that in the contract data to have it monthly, and they'll tack that on as a standing agenda item onto their monthly progress update, which is fine. But as long as you're talking about those early warnings on a regular basis, you're complying with the contract. 15.3 sets out an agenda. Again, have a look at that, but it's fairly commonsensical that the parties consider all of the early warnings. They determine what's the best thing to do about it. They seek proposals to bring a benefit to everyone involved, is what the contract requires you to do. But yeah, it's fairly commonsensical. You just have to discuss them on a regular basis. Question here from Elena, right on topic. Are early warnings issued only from the contractor to the client, not the other way? Nope, that's not right. Either party. That means the project manager or the contractor can give an early warning to the other, and they're encouraged to do that. Given the nature of the job that the contractor does, about 80% or so will probably come from the contractor, but the other 20 can come from the PM. That's, you know, it's not a hard fact, that it's not hard science, could be 50-50, but either party can notify, to answer your question. And the same for a compensation event, yes. Under clause 61.1, if the project manager gives an instruction to change the scope or to change the works information, then the PM is required to notify it. For all of the compensation events that are not triggered by the PM, then it's up to the contractor to notify it. And this is a big topic that we're going to look at later on this evening, Elena. I've got a couple of slides where I've highlighted all of the project manager compensation events, the ones that they're required to notify, and then by deduction, all of the other compensation events that the contractor is required to notify. And as we'll see later, understanding this point is actually very important because it impacts that 8-week time bar. To cut a long story short, compensation events that should have been notified by the project manager are not subject to the 8-week timer, which might be news to some people, but we'll examine that a little bit later on. But good question. 15.4 just talks about revising the early warning register, and that is up to the PM, so the project manager, to do that. They are the custodian of the early warning register, or risk register if you're working with NEC 3, same thing. What I'm about to do now is to talk about this interface between early warnings on the one hand and compensation events on the other. So what I've set up to this point is to treat them entirely separately. And for the most part, that is really good advice. But there is a small overlap between the two mechanisms, which is what we're about to go on and look at here. And that overlap lives within clause 63.7. So I'm going to give you an example just to talk through how those two mechanisms work in conjunction with one another. So here's our little example. If a contractor and this is what the contract says, if the contractor fails to give an early warning of something which an experienced contractor would have early warned, then there are repercussions. And that's exactly what these two clauses set out. If a contractor should have given early warning but didn't, then there are repercussions. So let's look at this by way of a worked example. Let's say, and I've already used this example before, the contractor is constructing a concrete basement. So again, it's sunk into the ground, high water table, picture that scenario, and discovers that no waterproofing membrane has been specified on the drawings or within the scope, or NEC 3 language, works information. So my question there on the screen, is this a compensation event at this point? Has a compensation event arisen here? Someone jump on the microphone and talk me through it. You've got drawings telling you what to build, specification telling you what to build. Is there a compensation event here? What do we think? Jump on the mic, jump onto the chat box. What do you think? No. Craig, you've now volunteered. Why is there no compensation event here, Craig? Jump on the mic if you can, or type away.
Because nothing's changed in the contract.
Exactly right. You know, when you start talking about compensation events, the most common one is a change to the scope. Yeah, 60.11 is the clause for that. But that hasn't happened here. You've just been given the scope, and that's the contractor's job to build it. There's no compensation event. But what would an experienced civil engineering contractor do in this scenario before they ploughed on ahead and installed the concrete without the waterproofing membrane? Early warn it, Jamie, exactly. And the reason you have to early warn it is because of these repercussions. The contract sets out, if something happens that a reasonable contractor would have early warned, which we're all agreeing is the case here, but they don't do it, then there are repercussions. So let's look at what those repercussions are. So there's two scenarios here. Option one, they build to the drawings, they cover up the concrete, they get instructed then to open it up and install the membrane. So they didn't give an early warning here. At the end of the day, you always needed to have that early warning membrane. So the instruction to go and retrospectively install it, what would that be? Again, contractor has built to the drawings, installed it without the membrane, and they're now being told to dig it up and install it retrospectively. What would that be? You're being asked to do something different, Gordon, aren't you? Yep, that's an instruction to change the scope, change the works information. That is a compensation event. So we'll park that scenario there for now and we'll come back to it. Scenario B is what should happen. And this is where the contractor gives an early warning. So what happens in that scenario? Well, they're told at an earlier stage to update the drawings, and then they go and install it and proceed ahead to get everything closed up. What's the difference in those two scenarios? It's a compensation event both ways. Yeah, the instruction to update the drawings is a change. It's a compensation event. But what's the difference cost-wise? What was avoided in scenario B? What's at the contractor's expense, Jerry? Only part of it the contractor has to take on the chin. Exactly, Retha, the opening up cost. Why? Because all of that opening up cost could have been avoided had they give the early warning. So that's what these clauses are saying. If something happens that you could have early warned, but you didn't, then the compensation event is assessed as if you did. In other words, it's assessed based on scenario B, even if scenario A happened. There's quite a lot on that slide. What I'll let you do, I'll let you go and digest it in your own time, but hopefully you understand the importance of a contractor giving an early warning. What these clauses do not say is you have to give an early warning to be entitled to a compensation event. That's not correct. That was one of the points that came up earlier on in the session. You don't have to do that. Where the interface is in how the resulting compensation event will be assessed. I had one question there from Andrew that I missed. Question is, but even if a contractor is penalised for not giving an early warning, they will simply dispute it anyway. Well, yes, they would, but then it would be within your rights to go to the likes of the ICE to get a good adjudicator appointed. I'm on the ICE panel. We're one of the only panel in the UK of adjudicators that have a qualification. Everybody has a qualification in managing NEC contracts. And if you've got the likes of an adjudicator that knows how this contract operates, then even though they dispute it, Andrew, they're probably going to come off on the wrong side of it. But I do take your point. So that then takes us on to the programming provisions. The short answer to this is, and the reason that you use programming provisions is because the compensation events revolve around it. You use the program to assess compensation events, and that is why getting the program right is so important. You don't just use the program to manage the works. Yes, you'll do that. Absolutely, contractors will do that. But you also use the program to assess compensation events. And that's what makes the NEC different on this point. So what is the point then? Used to manage the progress of the works. Obviously, contractor will go and get their procurement and their supply chain in order based on that program and the progress that's being achieved. But what makes the NEC different is the fact that you also use it to assess compensation events. Okay, and we're going to look at that in the next segment this evening with reference to a worked example. How do you use the program to assess a compensation event? Under the NEC, you also use the program in a slightly different way if you're under one of these other main options. So if you're under main option C, D, E, or F, then the program also has a third function. And that third function is to forecast how much the contractor is due to be paid. That is a mechanism we're going to look at next week when we're looking at payment. But to cut a long story short, let's have a monthly sort of rolling payment interval here. So this is payment interval 1, payment interval 2, payment interval 3. This is the end of month 1, end of month 2, end of month 3, and so on up to the completion of the project. Under option C, you don't simply look back the way to see how much work the contractor has done and pay them accordingly. That's what you do under option A and option B. Under these options, you look back the way as part 1 of the exercise, but you also have to look forward. You forecast in the month ahead how much money is the contractor going to pay out, and you pay them that amount also. So it has a fairly significant impact on the contractor's cash flow. And this is how the payment mechanism works under those other main options. But as I say, that's just a very quick introduction. We're going to look at that a little bit more detail in the next session, session 3. The final thing that we have on our slide there is another, if you think of carrots and sticks to, incentivize people, this one is a stick. This is the ability of the PM to withhold 25% of the contractor's payment if they don't provide that first program in accordance with the contract. It's got nothing to do with the second program, third program, etc. It's all about the first program. And it's not actually an ability to do that, it's a requirement. It's a mandatory requirement on the PM to deduct that amount of money. Porrick, is it mandatory to cost load the program for options C and F? It would be bloody helpful, Porrick, if people did do that, but no is the answer. You'll have your program, something like this, whatever. And against each of these activities, you're required to resource load it. Yeah, whatever way you spell that. But you're not required to cost load it. If you have the resources and you know the rates for those resources, Porrick, then you can do that. But strictly speaking, no, you only have to show the resources, which is what we're about to go on and look at on this slide. So clause 31.2 sets out the detail that the contractor must show on each of its program submissions. For instance, Porrick, if you have an option C, you might want to add cost information onto this list, and you're free to do that because the final bullet point of this clause allows you to add any further requirements to the program within the scope itself. So within your scope, yours would look something like this, extra program requirements, and you would say cost information or something along those lines. But you're free to do that if you want. All of the other things then, there are 15 different bullet points within this clause. I've paraphrased them here just to get it onto one slide. But the point remains, there are 15 different things that a contractor must show on each of their program submissions. And there's also a few extra things when it comes to revised programs that we'll look at shortly. But those include the likes of the starting date, access date, key dates, and completion dates. That's what I would call the skeletal information, the skeleton of the thing. Those are the milestones that have to be met. If your program doesn't have that, it's obviously wrong. The next thing is an NEC special. Well, arguably, the likes of FIDIC has something like it. It's not just as clear. The JCT doesn't have anything like this. And this is the requirement to show this, the contractor's planned completion date. Now, that is not the same as this one. Again, there's two terms here that sound very similar. There's the completion date, capital C, capital D. That is the contractual deadline. That is when the contractor must finish. It's a line in the sand, capital C, capital D. And if you finish after that deadline, what do you start paying? If you have option X7 in the contract, you finish late, LDs, delay damages, to use NEC language, same thing. You start paying those liquidated damages. Plan completion is different. That is some point in time that the contractor plans to complete the works. So their program, that's the date that it ends. This period of time between the planned completion date and the contractual deadline, which is the completion date, is what we call terminal float, okay? And this is the point. This terminal float is owned by the contractor, okay? It's under other forms of contract, it's just float. So whoever uses it, whoever gets their float first, they can use it. The project owns the float is the way to think of it. But under the NEC, the contractor owns that terminal float. So if there's a compensation event, which is an employer risk or a client risk, then the whole period of terminal float moves out and it's protected. We're going to look at that with a couple of very fancy, animated slides shortly, but I'm just trying to explain what this term is first of all. That's when the contractor plans to finish all of the work, which is not the same as the deadline. The next thing is a bit more obvious. That's the order and timing of operations. So that's getting all of your logic links in to, fully detail out the methodology. There's no requirement to use logic links, but in my opinion, if you're not logically linking your program, there's something wrong, because that does the work for you when it comes to resequencing. But I do appreciate that logic links is computer logic. It doesn't necessarily equate to logic on site. They're two different concepts, which is why the courts don't really like program analysis done on computers, but that's a separate discussion. Float, time risk allowance, health and safety requirements, procedures in the contract, which is a good one. So if you're required to submit your design to the project manager for acceptance, and they have 2 weeks to respond to that, you would want to get all of those timeframes built into the contract and built into the program so that everybody knows what they have to do and when. This penultimate bullet point is a key one, and it touches on a point that we made a moment ago, and that is the requirement to show your resources, to show the principal equipment that you're going to be using to deliver the job, along with other resources, again, your gangs of labor, etc. And if I was a project manager, I would be looking for that information, because it's this information that you use to help you assess compensation events. If you've done your program correctly, you will have a document that shows you how the contractor plans to do the work. It's much easier, or it's much more difficult than you might imagine trying to talk and draw at the same time, which is why these squiggles are so poor, but bear with me. So if you're a project manager and you have to assess a compensation event and you've got a program in place, you can work out how much it was going to cost the contractor before the compensation event took place, because you can see what equipment they were going to have on the site, how long it was going to take. You have the durations, you apply a rate to that duration, and you can work out that before the compensation event, the contractor was going to suffer costs of 100 grand. You then get a revised program as part of the compensation event process that shows a different method. You now have the digger on site longer, you've got the labor on site longer, and it's now going to cost them 120 grand. And you've worked all of that out with reference to the program. So the value of this compensation event is the 120, take away the 100, there's your 20K. You then go and you add on the fee, and we'll look at all that later, but it's all revolving around the program, and that is the point. Malachi question, how and where is the likes of the method statement to be presented? A lot of tenders I work on are fully compliant NEC programs is requested, but you're told to put it on an A3 Gantt chart. Can't be done. I agree with that. You don't have to, put the method statement on the program itself. You can link that to another document. The method statements that you'll provide as part of your tender have to relate to the methodology in the program. It's maybe the other way to think of that, Malachi. But you absolutely don't have to have the full method detailed out within the program itself. Question there from Gahinde, which is, what is time risk allowance? So again, I'll explain this a little bit later on when we look at our worked example, but for now, time risk allowance is the difference between how long you put in your program for an activity, let's say 2 weeks, and how long you actually think it will take. You might think in this scenario, it's only going to take me 1 week, but you know what? Just to be just to be careful, I'm not too sure what the ground conditions might be like. I'm going to allow 2 weeks instead. Time risk allowance is this extra bit at the end, TRA. You're building float into your program to account for risks that have a chance of occurring. Question from Kieran, is it mandatory to establish and communicate the program critical path to contractors? There's nothing within the NEC that requires you to show a critical path, you know, with reference to a red line or anything like that, Kieran. It's something you might want to add as an extra requirement. But at the end of the day, if you've properly logic linked all of your activities together, it will generate a critical path. And from a contractor's perspective, you know, communicating where the critical path is quite important. And ultimately, if a compensation event happens that impacts something on the critical path, you'll be making a big song and dance about it because it will cause critical delay. So I think that answers your question, Kieran. No, it's not mandatory, but it's absolutely advised. Final point then, just on the program. So people often call this the clause 31 program, you know, the first program, and then they refer to the clause 32 program. Again, I've seen that terminology batted around very, very regularly. Clause 32 simply refers to the revised program. What you have to do is show all of that information that we've just discussed on clause 31.2, plus all of this extra info. This extra info shouldn't take much time. You know, it's just a case of actually impacting the program, you know, to show actual progress. All of the work is in getting the first program done. If you do that correctly, then you're simply updating it as you go along. Unless, you know, something out of the blue happens and you have to fully resequence everything, it might be a different story. So the 4 points you have to consider: actual progress on each operation. It doesn't define how you have to do that. Different software packages will do it differently. You know, percentage completion, you might link it into how much has been paid for the activities. Lots of different ways of doing that. None of them are right necessarily. It just has to show the actual progress in some way. And, you know, it's very difficult to actually use those percentages in real life, because what does 10% complete mean? You know, that's a fairly arbitrary number in its own right. How the contractor will deal with delays, how they'll correct any notified defects, and any other proposed changes to the methodology. And the point is, the program is not necessarily, you know, a contractual rule book. You don't have to follow that method to the letter as a contractor. Your ultimate obligation as a contractor is to meet the key dates and ultimately to meet the completion date. Everything in between that is to an extent up to you. So if you need to shift around a methodology because a subcontractor has let you down or gone insolvent or whatever the case happens to be, then you are free to do that. You should early warn it and tell the PM that something has happened, and as a result of that, we need to sit down and have a discussion and let's get the program updated together. That's the best way to deal with it. Because as I say, you're not bound by the program, you're bound by the dates in the program. The final point I'll make on this before we go on to compensation events is the potential for a big mess. If you do not, and take this as a word of warning from an adjudicator who decides these disputes all too regularly, and an advisor who advises on these disputes even more regularly, if you don't keep on top of the program, it will become a big mess. It will become an omelette, and see, trying to unscramble the eggs of that omelette, it becomes a nightmare. And the amount of money you're going to spend paying experts to resolve it will far outweigh the little bit of effort it would have taken to maintain it as you go along. The ethos of this contract within clause 10.2 is to collaborate, to work together in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. And the program, in my opinion, is the thing that requires the most cooperation. Don't do this via email tennis. If you can get yourselves into one room to talk about the issue and to walk out of that room with a new accepted program in place, that's the best way to do it. If you start leaving it for weeks and going up against all of the contractual time limits, they're limits, they're not targets, but if you leave it for all of those weeks that you can in theory do, it will then become out of date. A couple of compensation events will have arisen in the interim, and that makes everything on paper not seem correct anymore. you're better doing it at the time, and you're better cooperating it with one another and cooperating on it with one another. I would say that's the biggest piece of advice you're going to be given this evening. Get the program right, work on it with one another. Get the PM's planner and your planner to go out for pints, to get to know one another, because they're going to get to know each other very well if they're working on an NEC project. There's a question there from Peter. If the contractor's first program is being met or beaten, does he need to issue a revised program? Yes. Once the program does not meet, the actual progress of work on site, the contractor is free to submit a new one. I haven't presented it on this slide because we can't go into every clause, but there are 3 scenarios in which a contractor can submit a revised program. The first of which is within the period. And these are in no particular order in the contract. So most contracts require the program to be updated monthly. And if you get to that deadline, progress has been fantastic on site, then you should put that in your program. You should move your planned completion date to the left-hand side if that's what's happening. Or when the PM asks for one, so if you're the PM and you think the contractor's progress on the site no longer reflects what they've provided on paper, then you can ask them for a new one. Or alternatively, and logically, the only other option is when the contractor wants to. Contractors, you can submit a revised program for acceptance at any time. So if you think your program is no longer, reflecting reality, submit a new one. Tim, is there timelines on a clause 32 acceptance? I did have a slide for this, but I took it out just for the sake of brevity. Yes, there is. It's within clause 31. It's either 31.3 or 31.4. It's one of those 2 clauses anyway. When the contractor submits a program for acceptance, the PM has 2 weeks to respond to it. Under the NEC 3, that was it. It only said 2 weeks and there was nothing else. Under NEC 4, the position is slightly different. It's 2 weeks under NEC 4. And if the PM fails to accept it or reject it with reasons, then the contractor can notify that failure. And if they don't thereafter respond within 1 week, the program is deemed to be accepted. So those are the time frames, Tim, within NEC 3, 2 weeks flat, and within NEC 4, 2 weeks. If you don't do it, reminder, and if you don't respond within 1 week of that reminder, deemed to be accepted. So hopefully that answers your question, Tim. And that then takes us neatly on to clause 6, which is, arguably the most important clause in the whole contract. Because at the end of the day, if you have a job that's going really, really well, and everybody knows the NEC and whatnot, the likelihood is you'll never have to take the thing out of the drawer. But when the project is not going so well, or if the project was maybe poorly thought out at tender stage and there's lots of different changes, then you're going to get to know clause 6 very well. So it is important to know how to operate the compensation mechanism. So stepping back and looking at clause 6 from the helicopter perspective, these are the clauses within clause 6, then there are 7. They break down into, in my opinion, and the way I train people on this, into 3 different steps. Step 1 is what I call identify. Okay, you go to clause 60, and as we'll see shortly, within clause 60, there are 21 compensation events. That's it, 21. If you are using an option B, or which has got a bill of quantities, or if you're using some of the secondary option clauses, the likes of X2, which deals with changes in the law, then there might be a couple more. Let's say a few more. But generally speaking, there's 21 plus a couple of extra. And most of those live within clause 60. So that's step 1. Go to that clause and find what you're talking about. Always step 1 in this. Step 2 is another important step, and that is to notify. So you identify the event, and then you notify the event. Easy as 1, 2, 3. And step 3, which covers pretty much the rest of it, is to assess, or let's call it quantify, to get a rhyming triplet there. Identify, notify, quantify. Stroke assess. And it's as easy as that, folks. You go to the list, there's 21 things on that list. If it's on it, then you notify it. Once you've notified it, you then use the rules within clause 63 in particular to work out the cost impact and the time impact. I'm just going to sketch two clauses on here, the two most important clauses within that 63 umbrella. 63.1 tells you how to work out the cost. 63.5 tells you how to work out the time, or the extension of time, if you want to use that term. The NEC doesn't use that term, but it's the same thing. How do you work out how much longer the contractor gets? Are there any questions at a high level on what's under the hood of clause 6? Okay, we're about to get into each of these steps in a bit more detail, but are there any preliminary questions before we get in? Do you see anything to do with early warning? Having to give an early warning to be entitled to any of this? The key thing, the key message I'm trying to get across? Anyone? Take the silence as that was a very obvious question. No, because we covered that earlier. You don't need to early warn to get into this clause, and that is a misconception, and hopefully everyone has that misconception now ironed out. So as a preliminary point, just before we start looking at what the compensation events are, how to notify, how to quantify, I just want to talk about how they are different, or how the compensation event mechanism is different to the likes of the JCT or FIDIC, Public Works, RIAI, IChemE, whatever other contract you've dealt with. This is probably quite different. So the first point is this, that you deal with the assessment at the time. So if you have your little timeline, I think I went through this before, you'll have lots of little assessments as you go along, lots of mini disputes over quantum and valuation. But the point is, you do it as you go along. There are time frames within the contract that require you to notify and quantify within certain periods of time. And we'll look at those time frames shortly. Instead of, like other forms of contract, dealing with it all at the end, where you now have a massive dispute on your hands and it's probably going to be too difficult to resolve. So that's why the NEC has it done at the time. This is another significant point then, that all of the compensation events, without exception, are time and money events. The likes of the JCT, there are two categories of event. There are time only, and there are a totally separate category, which are time and money. And the event that you're talking about will fall into one category or the other. It doesn't go into both. For example, under the JCT, force majeure, or weather, another example, are time-only events. So if COVID-19 happened and you had a JCT contract, you were only going to be able to get an extension of time. No money associated with it. You're on site 6 months longer, but you don't get any prelims. That's what that boils down to. The exact same thing, again, we don't call it force majeure, but it's the same concept, under NEC is what we call a prevention event. And because it's an NEC compensation event, you get the extension of time, but you also get the prelims, because all of the compensation events allow you to recover time and money. Okay, this category doesn't exist. Time only, not a thing under NEC. Hopefully everybody understands that point and also understands the significance of it, because that's quite a different position on those risks under two very well-used contracts. Again, COVID-19, you only get time. COVID-19, you get time and money. Massive difference. This next point is one that we're going to look at in depth with respect to our worked example. But that term, define cost plus fee, is how you work out the value of a compensation event. As we'll see as part of our worked example, define cost is a reference to another document, and that document is called the Schedule of Cost Components. And what you effectively do is you go away and you find that other document, Schedule of Cost Components. It's within the contract. This is a professional services, but if you flick to the back of it, it will list out the Schedule of Cost Components. All of the other contracts have something similar. And you'll see that there are 8 different headings within that schedule. And it's as simple as this. If the cost that the contractor is claiming falls onto that list of 8 different things, then they can claim it. Therefore, it forms part of their defined cost, okay? You do that exercise for the work before the compensation event had any impact. And let's say, using the example we looked at earlier, you work out the cost from first principles. The defined cost of doing the work before the compensation event was going to be 100 grand. You do the exact same thing for the impacted program, the impact of the compensation event. Again, looking at your list of 8 different things, and it's now going to cost 120k of defined cost. That's the first step in the compensation event assessment process. You've now worked out your change in defined cost. What is it here? 20 grand. But the point is, under the NEC, you don't stop there. You have an extra step and you have to add something on to that. And that extra something is what we call the fee, which is the other part of that statement. We'll see in our worked example, but typically speaking, the fee is a straight up percentage. Let's say 10%. You would add that on to your defined cost. So the total value of this compensation event would be, mathematicians in the audience, again, we're probably all engineers here. We've all done a fairly advanced level of mathematics in our time. What's the value of this compensation event? 20k plus 10%, 22, exactly. As I say, that's a very, very quick introduction to how to assess a compensation event. It's all about defined cost plus fee, and we're going to look at that later on with respect to a worked example to make it all make sense. Terminal float as well, I've already introduced that concept. That's that period of time at the end of the project between the contractor plans to finish and when they will actually finish, or when they're required to finish. Point being, contractor owns it. So if a compensation event happens, it doesn't eat into the float. The whole period of float is protected. And we'll look at that again with respect to our worked example. These 2 things, again, working out the cost under clause 63.1 and working out the time impact under clause 63.5, all revolve around the program. You look at the program to see how much the contractor was going to pay before the event. You then look at the revised program submitted as part of their quote to work it out after. Take one away from the other, there's the cost. You look at the program to understand what the terminal float was, to make sure the planned completion date is being moved to protect the terminal float. So again, it's all to do with the accepted program. And as I say, we'll look at our work example to make that make sense. And then finally, we have built into clause 61.3, what's known as a condition precedent. That's a fancy legal way of saying a time bar in this context. And a couple of people have mentioned it already, but that is the requirement to notify a compensation event within 8 weeks. And if you don't do that, you will lose your entitlement. Even though it's a legitimate claim, if you simply fail to notify it, because it's a condition precedent, you will lose your entitlement. And again, just to reiterate one final time, the early warning notice does not stop the 8-week timer. The only thing that will stop it is a compensation event notice under that clause. Gordon has got a question. What if a contractor is sending in compensation events following the works, i.e. claiming actual works, not assessed works? Well, that's fine, because as we'll see shortly, the line in the sand that you use to determine actual cost and then everything else is a forecast, we call that line the dividing date. And that line is when they give the notification, Gordon. So if they give the notification after the work is done, subject to the 8-week timer, of course, then they're fine to do it on an actual cost basis. But if they notify it at the start of the problem, then it should be on an assessed basis. Does that make sense, Gordon? It's all about figuring out what the dividing date is in that scenario, which again, we'll look at with respect to our worked example. And the final word that I have here is this word unless, and I've mentioned this before. This is a really important one. There are only some compensation events that are subject to the 8-week timer. and there are some that are not. And I'm going to make a big deal of this shortly. I'm going to look at all of the compensation events that are not subject to that time bar. So bear in mind that we will look at that. Kieran's got a question. If a contractor has been asked to accelerate to keep program, can this be a compensation event? You cannot instruct acceleration under the NEC. That's a point. There's no compensation event for acceleration because you can't instruct it. What you can do is agree it, and under, I think it's clause 36 of the contract, it sets out an acceleration mechanism, and it all requires the parties to agree to that acceleration. So to directly answer your question, no, it wouldn't be a compensation event. It would be an agreement to accelerate under clause 36. Kieran, to answer that question directly. But the main point is it has to be done via agreement. If you're a project manager, you can ask the contractor for a quotation for accelerating, and if you're happy with it, you can instruct it to go ahead. But the contractor can say no. They shouldn't say no, they should give reasons for saying no, but they can in theory. So what I've done in this slide and the next two slides is put a paraphrased extract of each of the compensation events under the contract. We don't have time this evening to go into each of these in detail, so I'm not going to do that. I'll let you read over these in your own time, but I've just tried to highlight what exactly you can claim as a compensation event. And by virtue of these things being compensation events, they're employer risks. That's all they are. So if they happen, the contractor's not deemed to have priced for it, and they can claim more time and money because it's a compensation event. So what you can see here, of the 7 events I've highlighted on the screen, I've highlighted 3 of them in green. What is the common theme of the ones I have highlighted in green? What are they all triggered by? Instructions by who? The project manager. It's the PM giving an instruction in this case. And this is what we're about to look at. Those types of compensation events, the compensation events that arise from the PM or the supervisor giving an instruction or changing a decision or giving a certificate, something that is PM or supervisor led, they are not subject to the 8-week timer. Okay. There's lots of legal reasons why that has to be the case. It's called the prevention principle that I'll not get into in any detail, but there's lots of legal reasons why it has to be this way, why you can't have a time bar stuck on compensation events like that. But all you need to know is that the ones I've highlighted in green are not subject to the 8-week timer. What does that then say about all of the rest? Contractors in the audience, what do you need to do to all of the other compensation events if they happen? Notify within that 8-week timer. And again, give the notice under clause 61.3. If you're used to working under public works, I know we've quite a lot of my fellow Irishmen and women in the audience. That's equivalent of clause 10.3 of the public works, rather famously, where if you don't notify, you get nothing. And the NEC has the same thing, but only for these events that are not PM led. So again, I'm just going to get through these quickly because we don't have time to go into each of them in detail. There's another couple. So you can see, again, the supervisor coming in here. Again, it's supervisor led. It's the PM or supervisor changing a decision. So it doesn't have to be an instruction. It can be a change of decision. For example, not agreeing that something is a compensation event and then changing your mind. That would be a compensation event in its own right. The other thing that I want to point out here, which does bear sort of writing down because the NEC doesn't cross-reference itself. This compensation event for the civil engineers in the audience is a biggie. This is effectively the NEC ground conditions compensation event. And what it sets out is this. You are deemed to have priced the physical conditions based on, in accordance with clause 60.2, the site information. We touched on this briefly in the last session, but you take the site information, There's a few other things under that clause, but broadly speaking, it's the site information and things that are referred to in it, things that you could obtain from a visual inspection, etc. And that's how you price the ground. So based on that set of documents, you thought the ground was nice and solid, for example. But then you get to the site, you put your spade into the ground, and it turns out it's very, very soft. So you can no longer build in accordance with your methodology. And you need to change the foundation design. You now need to put piles in instead of going for something other than that. And at that stage, because the site information allowed you to price it in that way, this compensation event would be triggered, because no experienced contractor would have made an allowance for soft ground based on that interpretation of the site information. And that's effectively how this ground conditions clause works. The main reason I'm pointing that out is because you need to also look at this clause, and they're not together on the page. You need to know if it's something to do with ground conditions, I need to go look somewhere else. And you look at clause 60.2 and also clause 60.3, which sets out how you deal with ambiguities, etc., within the ground conditions. There's a question there, what about early contractor involvement? I don't think that's too relevant here. That's a slightly different topic. Under X22, either X21 or X22, it's one of those two anyway, you have the ability to use early contractor involvement, and you might, as part of that, examine, Paul, thanks, it is X22, always go with your gut instinct. That's a lesson in that. As part of that early contractor involvement ECI period, the contractor might, be invited to the site to carry out some more ground investigation, and that risk might be transferred to the contractor. I think that's maybe the point that you're making, Kehinde. And if that's the case, then none of this applies. But I'm talking about the fact here, if you don't have early contractor involvement and the ability to do that. But good point. And then the final round of compensation events, again, using the same little theme, all of these ones in green are led by the PM. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of them, almost half of these compensation events are not subject to the 8-week timer. So always have that in mind. The final one that I just want to mention is this one. So this isn't really a compensation event. It's more of a portal to another part of the contract, and that takes you to the contract data. And this is a really, really useful addition. This is a new thing under NEC 4. This didn't exist under NEC 3. And what you can do under that clause is go into the contract data and add in extra risks that you want to be compensation events. And that makes tendering for these jobs an awful lot easier, because, if you flagged a risk at an early stage and you're not sure which party that risk lies with, you can make it very clear by stating it as being a compensation event in the contract data if you want it to be an employer risk. To give an example, I was drafting an NEC contract a number of years ago at this point. Time is certainly ticking on. It was to do with the construction of a pier for bringing in fuel, obviously from the fuel tankers to onshore to connect to the infrastructure to take to the petrol stations. So you can sort of picture the scene. And as part of that, they had to do a little bit of refurbishment work on the existing pier before they built the extension. And one of the risks that was identified is the fact that the divers can't do work if the swell is above a certain level. And the NEC doesn't deal with that. That's a very, very specific type of risk. So what the client did in that scenario, again, on our advice, was add that into the contract data as a compensation event. So we set out what would happen in the event that the tide and the swell went above a certain level, which triggered a compensation event and entitled the contractor to their standing time in that period. And that just made negotiation of the contract an awful lot easier. We didn't have to go in and fiddle with the contract and add different Z clauses, because we could just add it as a new compensation event. And I'm starting to see more of that happening as contractors are diligently reviewing, tender documents. They're spotting things that perhaps aren't clear. I saw another one recently to do with the bearing capacity of the ground at a certain part of the site where no SI had been done in a number of years, and the whole design sort of was based on that bearing capacity being correct. So diligently, the contractor said, if that's not correct, I want compensation because I'm going to have to fix the design. And again, that was put in as a new compensation event. Just made everything an awful lot easier. You know, that's one way of doing it. Same with COVID. Again, seeing people add COVID, new COVID events into there, perfectly legitimate. So those are the compensation events. As I said a couple of slides back, the vast majority of those events live in the one clause. So if you get your contract out, again, this is a subcontract, same thing, and you flick to clause 60.1, there it is. You will find all of the compensation events listed, 21 of them anyway. But as I was saying, there's a couple more that you need to be conscious of depending on the type of NEC contract you're dealing with. If you are dealing with an NEC option B or an option D, which are the two main options that have a bill of quantities, then there are extra compensation events due to the fact that you have bills of quantities. And those exist under these three clauses. I'm actually dealing with one of these at the moment under an option B. 60.4 makes it a compensation event if the rate that you have in the contract data, the quantity, I should say, if the quantity changes by a certain amount. So if the quantity vastly changes upwards or downwards, and the word vastly is my own word, there's a test within the contract about 0.5% of the prices. Again, it's a very accurate test. If that quantity goes up or down by that amount, then the rate is adjusted accordingly as a compensation event. Again, it's got a mechanism built in because it's a compensator, because it's a bill of quantities. Changes in the law, X15, again, there's a couple of other compensation events in there just to be wary of, but those are the main ones just to focus on. Question from Graham, would new COVID event need to be added in, or is it already covered under clause 60? So that's a good question. In my opinion, COVID-19, if you're entering into the contract, you know, in 2023 or 2022, is a contractor risk. And the reason it's a contractor risk and not a compensation event is because of how this clause is worded. This is the clause that people were claiming COVID-19 under back in early, what was it, 2020? Yeah, I think it was early 2020. And the point is this, for this compensation event to be triggered, 3 boxes have to be ticked off. Number 1, the event has to cause critical delay. It's not worded like that, slightly different, but that's what it boils down to. Did the event cause delay? Graham, since you volunteered, March 2020, did COVID-19 cause delay to projects? Generally speaking. I'm going to march you through the test for this compensation event. Yes, it did. So that box is ticked off. Number 2, the event, so COVID in this case, has to have been something that neither party could have prevented. So is that the case, Graham? Could either party have prevented COVID-19? Clearly not. So that box is also ticked off. Graham is cooking and listening, so this is difficult. Again, fair play for being able to do both. The third test is, and this is the important one, and this is where I'm going with this. It depends on when you sign the contract. And the question under the third limb is this. At the contract date, would a reasonable contractor have allowed for that event? So if you signed the contract in December 2019, would you expect a reasonable contractor to have made allowance for COVID-19? Clearly not, clearly not. And because that last box is also ticked off, again, yes, meaning all 3 boxes are ticked, then it was triggering this compensation event. So circling back to your original question, Graham, would a new COVID event need to be added in, or is it already covered? Do you think a new COVID event would satisfy this box? Would you expect contractors to be making due allowance for COVID-19 moving forward? It's not a black and white answer. It's a great question, but you know, it's not black and white as the answer. I don't think you could reasonably expect a contractor to make, you know, an allowance for a new strain of COVID-19 that's going to completely radicalize. But yes, they might want to take account of, you know, small bumps in the road that's not quite there. So that's the test that you have to ask yourself, Graham, as to whether or not it's already covered under clause 60. And for those difficulties, and the reason that I'm getting here is why some people are adding it in anyway, just as a new compensation event to make the position clear, to avoid having to go to adjudication to have that final question answered. So that's the point, Graham. And if you can't win a tender, if you did make an allowance for it, then that's pointing towards having it added as a new compensation event under clause 21, because it means you don't have to price it at that point, and everybody will be pricing the job on an even playing field. Good. So a couple of quick points then just on notification through to quantification then, which we'll probably finish off towards the start of next week's session, just to forewarn on that. I've already made this point. An early warning notice does not stop the 8-week timer, because an early warning notice is not a compensation event notice. They're two different things. Only a compensation event notice will stop the 8-week timer. Okay, I've made that point 2 or 3 times. I'm not going to dwell on it anymore, but I'm marking it in red for a reason. It's an important point. These are all of the compensation events then that we highlighted in green as we went along. As you can see, 8 of them, so 8 out of 21, are not subject to the time bar. You know, you're almost halfway there. And the point is this: which of those compensation events do you recognize? Which is the most prevalent on any construction project? In your experience, which one of those is the most prevalent on any construction project? The most prevalent compensation event, not even on the list. Malachi, exactly. The PM instruction to change the scope. That happens all the time, Laura, exactly. So the point is this: the most popular compensation event is not subject to the 8-week timer by virtue of it being a PM-led event. Okay, so contractors don't get too hung up on the 8 weeks if you're dealing with lots of changes to the scope. And the 8 weeks only applies to non-PM led events. So quick summary just of the notification timeframes here and the relevant clause numbers. So I put all of the clause numbers here for your reference, 61.3 and 61.4 in particular. So as we say, contractors, you've got 8 weeks to notify a compensation event. Unless what? I'm not going to insult your intelligence. We've already been through it. Unless the compensation event is project manager led. For example, giving an instruction to change the scope. So if it's not that, you've got 8 weeks to notify. If you have notified it, then the PM has got 1 week to respond. It's one of the shortest timeframes in the entire contract. And the reason it is short, because it should be fairly straightforward. It is a yes or no answer. And a good piece of advice I will give to clients in the audience: don't talk about money at step 1. Whenever you're notifying a compensation event, don't talk about the money. All you should be talking about is whether or not it is a compensation event or not. All you should be aiming to get at step 1 is that yes or no answer. What happens if you start talking about money too early in the process? You know, before the PM has even agreed that it is a compensation event, what will the PM naturally start to do if you've already started talking about money? What will their focus go towards? The money, yeah. And if the PM starts looking at the money and starts thinking, oh, it's never going to cost that, Gehinde, absolutely, they're going to push back. Paul, perhaps they might find a way to say it's not a compensation event. Absolutely, they could do that. They shouldn't, but they could. And for that reason, you shouldn't talk about money too early. And again, the PM has only got 1 week to make this decision. So make it as simple as possible. Dear sir, this is what's happened. You gave us an instruction on this date. it changed the scope because the scope didn't require that waterproofing solution. Therefore, it's a compensation event. Do you agree? Yes or no? Keep it simple. And as I say, by giving them and framing it in that question, they're able to answer within 1 week, which is what they have to do. Jerry, some web-based contract admin tools, we're not going to name names, look for money implications at step 1. They do. They talk about the estimate, and you don't have to fill in that box, is my understanding. It's not one of the ones that have a little asterisk beside it that you have to fill in. And again, I think the advice there still stands. You don't have to do it at an early stage. The next part of this slide, so everything after this line, is what we call the deemed acceptance mechanism. So in short, if the PM fails to respond within that 1 week time frame, then the contractor can issue a reminder. So the 7 days has elapsed and the PM has not done their job. The onus is then on the contractor to notify them of that failure. So the ball is back in the contractor's court here to do something, and they have to remind. Then, if the PM continues to fail to respond for a further 2 weeks, the compensation event is deemed to be valid. Okay, it's treated as being accepted by the PM, and you move on to the next step. You're deemed to have received an instruction to provide a quotation. So the event is now a compensation event, tick, and you move on to providing the quote for that event. Is everyone happy with that final step, that deemed acceptance mechanism? Again, it's rare enough to see contractors getting the whole way through that, or events getting the whole way through it, but it can happen. Richard, good question. What happens if the contractor fails to give this? Nothing. It just sits there in purgatory. So it is up to the contractor to do something about it if they want to have something done. It's as straightforward as that, Richard. There's no double up of the deemed acceptance mechanism. Question from Stephen, what way will it work with an annual leave, etc., and not getting the PM response, but an out of office reply? So that's what this mechanism is designed for, Stephen, to an extent, the PM not doing their job for whatever reason, if they're on holiday or just defaulting on their job. What the PM should, strictly speaking, do there is delegate some of its responsibilities under, I think it's clause 14 is the delegation provisions. So they should say, dear sir, Mr. Contractor, Mrs. Contractor, I am off on leave this week, and in the interim, all notifications are to be addressed to whoever it happens to be. And that's how you should deal with that, Stephen. But if you don't, that's what this mechanism's for. Good. So whatever way you get there, again, either the PM has instructed you to provide a quotation because they're happy that it is a compensation event, or alternatively, it's treated as being accepted, you get to this next step, which is to provide a quotation. So in short, the quotation is fairly straightforward. The quotation mechanism is straightforward. The first step, however, is often missed by people. And I think it's a really important step in the whole process. And it requires the parties to work together. Again, it's the first step of the process, and people always forget about it. You have now agreed that this thing that has happened on the site, that soft spot is unforeseen, and whatever it happens to be, or adverse physical conditions, to use the NEC language, it's now a compensation event. What you then have to do is discuss different ways of dealing with it. So as we all know, I'd imagine quite a lot of us are civil engineers. There's lots of different ways of skinning a cat, and there's lots of different ways of dealing with a soft spot on one part of the site. You could move the road around it, which is going to cost an awful lot of money, or you could, do a cut and fill exercise, whatever it happens to be. And that's the purpose of this clause, is to look at those different options. And perhaps, you might, as a project manager, ask for 2 different quotes. Quote for option number 1, quote for option number 2. And you can do that. You can submit as many alternative quotations as you want. And again, that's what clause 62.1 envisages, is the parties working together to potentially come up with different options, to ultimately come up with the best solution for the client. And again, knocking your heads together in a collaborative way is the best way to unlock that piece of value. So once you've done that then, and you've come up with, the scenario that you want to go for, this is what the quotation has to look like. Or you can do this for the two different alternatives if you have two or whatever. This is very, very straightforward, and it simply sets out what exactly the quotation has to look like. And in short, it boils down to two things: setting out your proposed change to the prices, in other words, the cost, and setting out your proposed changes to the program, in other words, the time impact. What I would always recommend contractors to do, instead of just doing this, of just providing a program for the alterations to the accepted program, I would always suggest providing a new program, fully impact the program for the compensation event that has arisen. And the theory being, once you provided that new program and you've got your Excel document, probably, that's got all of the cost information, and as part of that Excel document you might have invoices that go along with it, whatever that happens to look like, and packaged up, that is the quotation. And the theory is, if you provided that full program submission along with it, all the PM has to do is then accept it. Then you've now got a new program, a new accepted program in play, and you can start to use it moving forward. One of the difficulties with lots of different compensation events happening at the one time is the fact that it impacts the program differently. So what you need to do is this. Let's say you've got compensation event number 1 and compensation event number 2. Compensation event number 1 includes 2 weeks, 14 days of critical delay. And CE number 2 also has 14 days of critical delay. So what some people automatically think when you look at that in a register format is that the contractor's claiming a month of delay. You add them both together. But that's correct if you look at it in an Excel spreadsheet and you do a sum all and you count everything above, but that's not what happens in reality. Because in reality, your program for CE1, whenever you impact CE1, it might add an extra bar into your program. Once that compensation event has been accepted and you move your date out by 14 days, then perhaps that means that all of this delay falls away because you've already been given the extra time under CE1. You now have a new program in place. You should then use that program to assess CE2. And in doing so, it might change the amount of delay associated with it. Put it another way, if both of these CEs are concurrent with one another, you're only going to get the 1 14-day period of extension of time. And the only way that you can do that, in my opinion and experience, is by chronologically working through the compensation events and implementing them as you go. If you try to bundle all of these compensation events into one assessment, it does become difficult. Question from Gordon, very easy answer to this one. What happens if the PM does not provide a program along with its quotation? Straightforward, the PM can make their own assessment under clause 64 of the contractor. It might be 65 now under NEC 4, one of the two anyway. That's one of the reasons, Gordon, that the PM can make their own assessment if the contractor has not provided a quotation in accordance with the contract, and it will be up to the PM to do that based on its own assessment of the remaining program, which is never a good thing for a contractor to do because the PM's assessment is never going to be what it needs to be, and that can lead to problems. So provide the program is my advice. So in terms of timeframes, what you can do with these slides, folks, you can print them off and you put the other slide together, and that'll give you a timeline through the whole compensation event process, which is how these have been designed. But in short, the contractor, once you've been given that instruction to provide a quotation, you've got 3 weeks to provide it. If 3 weeks is not long enough, which quite often it isn't, if you've got a very big compensation event to assess, you're free to extend that time frame by agreement between the parties. I don't know the clause off the top of my head. I know most of these clauses, but I always forget that one. It's somewhere within clause 62. Both parties can agree to extend that time frame. So you're free to do that. If you need more time, ask for it, work together. Assuming, however, that the contractor has provided that quotation within the 3 weeks or whatever the extended time frame happens to be, then the PM has to respond to it within 2 weeks. And by the same token, if that 2-week time frame isn't long enough, then the parties can agree to extend it. Because again, not only does the PM, not know the job to the same level of granular detail as a contractor, of course they don't, and they know it at a higher level for obvious reasons. It's going to maybe take them longer to assess it, especially if it involves a full resequencing of the works. So sometimes 2 weeks isn't enough to do that. So extend it if you want to. The point is this: if the PM does not do that, if they don't respond within 2 weeks or whatever the extended period happens to be, then we also have this deemed acceptance mechanism or treated acceptance mechanism. And it's the exact same process that we looked at before and we examined before, whereby if the PM does not do their job, it's up to the contractor to issue that reminder notification and to give them that jolt that they need to do their job. If they fail to respond within 2 weeks of that reminder, again, exact same time frame as before, then it's deemed to be accepted. And this is a fairly significant thing at this point, because you're not being, deemed to have received an instruction to provide a quote at this point. It's deemed to be implemented. So whatever the contractor quoted, regardless of whether or not it's too much or too little, doesn't matter for the purposes of the contract, it is deemed to be accepted. So project managers and clients in the audience, you don't want to be letting things, fall into this accepted by default category. You always want to be responding on time. So are there any questions just on the quotation mechanism and the timeframes involved before we briefly touch on our final topic? Again, we'll finish off then the work example next week. These sessions are merging into one. It's one big long session. Don't think of them as 3 individuals at this point. But are there any questions before we look at the assessment rules? All happy? I'll take silence as a resounding yes. So here's a question from Maliki. What if something changes, i.e. additional masonry under worse weather conditions? That's a good question. Well, if you're needing extra masonry, you have to ask yourself the question, is it a problem with the client's design, or is it a contractor risk? If they're needing additional masonry because of bad weather, that sounds more like a fault with the design. So if that is the case, Maliki, how the contract deals with that is this. Under clause 80.1, problems with the client's design. And this sounds like a very non-hypothetical question, Maliki, assuming you're having something like this on site at the moment. Under clause 80.1, client's design is the client's risk. So if there is a fault within that design, then it would be a compensation event by virtue of clause 60.114, which sets out that client risks, such as client design under clause 80.1, is a compensation event. So maybe picked up that question wrong. So now you're saying, thinking of delay, i.e. work that should have been done earlier in time. So if what you're saying is this, that because of a compensation event, you're now being forced to do work that was due to be carried out in summer, over winter. Is that what you're saying, Maliki? It's like a consequential delay, then yes. Then you as a contractor have to account for that as part of your quotation. So this is a good question. So let's sketch it up. Let's say this period here is winter. So you now have a compensation event at the start of the job. Let's say lack of access. So 60.12 compensation event. And for whatever reason, that is now pushed an activity that was meant to be carried out in summer over winter. What you need to do, Maliki, in assessing this compensation event at the start of the job is have an awful lot of foresight. You need to look forward using your program and to understand what might happen into the future. For example, the weather affecting this masonry issue. Or again, I'm a civil engineer by training. Doing heavy civils work over winter is very, very difficult for obvious reasons. And as part of the quotation for this initial compensation event, Malachi, you need to account for it there. Okay. And that is actually quite a difficult thing to do. Trying to have that level of foresight is difficult, but nonetheless, under the NEC, you have to do that. I've seen a very novel example of this before, where the contractor was laying carpet tiles in a leisure centre project, and it was due to be taking place over the winter and August time. But because it was done over winter, the glue that they were using to set the carpet tiles wouldn't go off anymore. So they had to pay to bring in fans to heat up the building. And none of that was allowed for within their original quote for the delay, and they weren't able to claim for it. So yeah, you have to have a bit of foresight, Malachi, unfortunately. So that'll pretty much do us for it this evening, folks. Maybe just to introduce this worked example before we go. So little wastewater treatment work project, it can be any project. The point is that the contractor has started on the site and they've realized that they're unable to rip out the limestone in accordance with their tender methodology. And their tender methodology was based on the site information. And the site information showed that the rock should have been about 20 megapascals. So for the non-civil engineers in the room, that's a soft limestone that you should be able to rip out fairly easily, back of a digger bucket sort of thing. But the rock that they found on the site was actually something closer to 150 megapascals, which is very, very hard stuff. You can't rip out, that you have to break out with a rock hammer. And what we're going to do next week is start to look at how we would approach this scenario using the NEC contract, how to work out the cost of it, and how to forecast the impact of this event using the accepted program. But as I say, we're just on past now, so we'll stop it for now, and I will see you all next week. Hopefully everybody enjoyed tonight's session.
Yes, I'm just going to say thank you to everybody for attending, and to thank you to William as well. I will pause the recording and you will find out next week how to get to the recording, but I think it gets sent to you. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Haley, and see you all next week.